So it's a very frightening experience. I was experiencing a lot of
Good morning, everybody. As we have everyone come in and join us, we just ask that you take off your video and mute yourselves during the moderated panel discussion. Thanks.
A heart attack, and I was just mentally filled with fear, anxiety, terror. And so I was sick for about 4 months, 3 or 4 months.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you. Welcome to actually our last webinar on technology, innovation, entrepreneurship. Thank you for joining us today. We would like to just give you a brief introduction as why we're doing this and how Global Black Youth came about. Global Black Youth emerged out of the need to change the dominant narratives of young people of African descent, which is actually our operational theory, moving away from a deficiency approach to an asset-based orientation. And in the words of Dr. King and Dr. West, maladjusted to not just status quo, we create a global community of young disruptors and innovators of African descent and build bridges between the different communities of knowledge worldwide. GBY engages with and convenes the world's most disruptive, innovative, and entrepreneurial young Black leaders and supports them in producing knowledge and solutions that can ultimately impact a global society. We see the need to do this even more so now during this pandemic. This is why we're creating these conversations to bring visibility to the work and achievements, harnessing technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and reposition them as an untapped resource of knowledge that can address our global concerns. We increasingly see the innovation, particularly on the African continent, to address this crisis in all spheres of and disciplines. That can be a very valuable knowledge to all of us. So in this, I would like to introduce my co-founder, Nyeleti Howana, who will take this from here and will explain the structure of this call. And you'll soon meet some of the most engaging and innovative young experts we have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nusha, and I hope you'll all bear with me. I seem to be having connectivity issues. I'll try and be brief. Thank you again so much for joining us on this, our final leg of our Global Black Youth GBY webinar series, how Black communities are responding to COVID-19 around the world. We're so happy at the engagement that we've had so far. We've talked a lot about innovation, about technology, and this panel really brings that all together and looks a little bit more long-term at the economic impacts of COVID-19. So as I mentioned, I won't take up too much of your time. I'll just go through some of the house rules for this meeting. The panel today will be broken up in 3 sections. We'll start with a moderated panel discussion, which will last about 30 to 40 minutes. During that discussion, we invite you to write your questions, your comments in the chat as the conversation continues. Nusha and myself will collate those questions and present them to Chichi, our moderator today, to then pose to the speakers. So Chichi will do this kind of chat moderated session for about 20 minutes following the panel. And at the very end of this panel is when we'll go ahead and open it up for question and answer. We invite you to raise your hand, switch on your video, and be really interactive. We'll unmute you as we take 3 or 4 questions at a time, pose them to the speakers, and then come back to you, our audience members. This is an informal panel. We have kept it so on purpose. We encourage you all to speak to one another, respond to your comments in the chat, and also to what the speakers are saying. And then finally, given that this is our last of this current series, we will be leaving this room open about 15 minutes after the call. We found that what we're really missing in some of these Zoom calls is that person-to-person interaction, the meeting people and speaking to people before and after our, our usual in-person meetings. And so we're going to try and do that a little bit this morning, evening, and afternoon. And so if you need to hop off at the end of the moderated panel, we invite you to do so. But if you would like to stay and speak to myself, to Nusha, to the speakers, we invite you to do so. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Chi-Chi, who will be introducing herself, our speakers, and leading us through this moderated panel discussion.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for tuning in to this discussion series. So yes, my name is Chi-Chi, Chinonye Egbulem. I'm Nigerian American, and under normal circumstances, I should be in Uganda, where I work as a gender specialist, really working to combat the various issues pertaining to violence against children, and just overall violence in general. And so unfortunately, due to COVID, I am now stateside. I'm in North Carolina, and I'm happy to be a part of this discussion because as Nyeleti has mentioned, we globally, the world is being affected, but in particularly those in the global Black diaspora are being hit the hardest. And so the point of this conversation essentially is to brainstorm and figure out what is currently happening on the ground, especially with the entrepreneurs, the social disruptors, and really learn more about the resources available and how we can plug in. So with me today, I have amazing entrepreneurs that are based all over the global Black diaspora. We have Paulo from Brazil, we have Norbert from Rwanda, and we have Odunayo. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, and then we'll just dive right in.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, Global Black Youth, Nusha, Nyeleti. I'm Paulo, I'm Afro-Brazilian, so my current base in the city of Salvador, Bahia, the state of Bahia in Brazil, northeast of Brazil. And here I've been working for a couple of years in an initiative here to support Black entrepreneurs, Afro-Brazilian entrepreneurs, helping them to develop these skills. My background is media and technology, so I kind of plug these two things with entrepreneurship. So this initiative called Vale Dendê, and we have been supporting around 19 companies so far. So I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you, Paulo.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. So my name is Norbert Haguma. I'm greeting you from Kigali, Rwanda. I'm an entrepreneur and also an activist, especially for technology. So I'm a country manager for Spain Rwanda, which is a fintech company. That is my day job, and I'm a co-founder of AfricaGen and board member of the ATCG, which is on the activism side of things. So I'm very passionate about the intersection between technology and development. I like to think of myself as a problem solver. I really like to engage with the community. And this started back when I was living in China, where I did my university. I lived for more than 10 years. And I really like to say that I left Rwanda, I was Rwandan, and China made me African. So that's when the Pan-African enthusiasm and going from dreams into action came about. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here with you all.
Hi everyone, my name is Odunayo. I'm Nigerian. I'm the co-founder and chief operations officer for PiggyVest, a fintech company based in Lagos, Nigeria. And I'm very happy to be here. PiggyVest is an automated savings platform that allows young Nigerians to put aside little amounts of money daily, weekly, or monthly towards the target. And we also provide them with micro investment opportunities. I've been a startup founder for about 7 years. I started my first company right out of university, and that's what I've been doing ever since. I have founded about 6 companies, 4 of which have failed, and I'm currently working on PiggyVest while we handed the former one over to a different team to manage.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear all that you guys are doing on the ground. So before we dive into what it is, the ecosystems, please could you just kind of share with us more about what's happening on the ground with COVID? How is COVID affecting the people that you normally serve in general on a day-to-day basis?
Let me start here talking about Brazil. So, thank you for the question. It's a very urgent, important question. First of all, give a little bit of background about Brazil. As you all know, Brazil, it's a big country, 200 million people, 200 million plus people. And most of people don't know that half of this population are actually Afro-descendants, people who have African origin. Brazil, had this big and ugly background story about slavery, right? So as many other American countries. So we have been facing for more than 300 years of slavery and post-slavery in our society. So on the result of that, so inequality is a really big issue here. The disparities between the European descendants and the Afro-Brazilians and the indigenous Brazilian descendants are very high. And of course, when you have such a catastrophe as this pandemic of COVID-19, those communities who are Afro-descendants, they suffer more because they have a big problem of access to a good health. Although health is something worldwide here in terms of access, but those communities have less quality on their health. Also, they have preconditions, right? Diabetes and all this high blood pressure, all these problems. And so the health thing is really, really a big problem here, as it is in other countries like United States nowadays. Plus the economic side, that's what I'm trying to work more, where most of the business, are suffering hard times now, of course, in general. But if you take a slice of a really small business and a business on the communities, we call here favelas, or, grassroots communities or projects, people call it US, those are the most affected business because they don't have access to credit. They don't have access to government support. They don't have a relationship with the banks, so they really cannot survive. So we can talk more about that in a minute, but I'm working, trying to get some company to support with another initiative that I'm part of, which is a emergency fund called Todos. So it's an emergency fund really to help those entrepreneurs with some support in this moment to make them face with these moments a little bit better, because it's a personal problem, also it's a business problem.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paulo, for sharing. And yes, as you've mentioned, the same issues that you guys are facing there, we also see it here stateside. Hundreds of businesses are being subject to all kinds of vulnerabilities. And, we know that Black businesses, when it comes to even locating and trying to obtain access to funding opportunities. There are so many hurdles that our Black entrepreneurs face in working to surmount that. And you know, just as a result of COVID, we can see that all of the infrastructures that have been put into place slowly but surely are breaking down due to the lockdowns, and this is taking place globally. So yes, I'm just kind of interested. Odunayo, you mentioned that you had 4 failed businesses, and we all know that business in general is very hard. But the beauty of you know, the fact that COVID, the beauty of the opportunities that are coming out of you know, the fact that the entrepreneurs are coming together, brainstorming, trying to figure out how they can tap into the various competitions that are taking place worldwide. I'm curious to know, in Nigeria, have you noticed any change in saving practices and in people on the ground really mobilizing themselves, coming together to tap into these funding opportunities to address some of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the big gaps that like the crisis has exposed in Nigeria is our like complete and utter lack of infrastructure. So from health to public services, it's been inadequate, but in the middle of a global crisis, it becomes really obvious just how much we don't have. And that means that a lot of citizens have to take their own destinies and fate, so to speak, in their own hands. So what we've seen now is a lot of Nigerians, young people, saving more, stashing more, just so they don't have government help to fall back on. We don't have an arrangement for business relief as people in the US do. So business owners, entrepreneurs here, young people here, self-employed people here kind of have to make their money last. They have to manage it. So we've seen them saving more. We've seen societies and non-governmental organizations coming together to help feed people who are poor. For about 8 weeks when Nigeria was on lockdown, the country was in unrest because people couldn't earn, and we have about 100 million people who live in extreme poverty, which means that they earn day to day and they couldn't go to work. And we had like an increase in a string of robberies. So we had organizations come together to feed people, to give people relief, because the government hadn't like really come together to organize palliatives for the citizens. So we really do most things by ourselves for ourselves. So people are definitely saving more. We've seen an increase in people joining our platform, putting money aside, making investments for the future, because even as we know that we're still in the throes of the disease, Nigerians have a tendency to kind of look past it, what happens after, right? The government didn't help us during, so it only serves to like show us that after the crisis is past, we have ourselves to take care of ourselves. So we're saving more, coming together. There's a lot of like community support for like people who have less, and we're trying, even entrepreneurs, right? We're coming together and we have platforms like Angels Among Us, Meet a Need Today, where companies can do CSR and be able to help people who don't have. So far, it's been more of a community effort than a civil governmental effort.
Thank you, great. And these may be tools that for those of us who have tuned in, you know, can be adapted in our respective locations. And so, Odunayo, if people want to learn more about what it is that you're doing, where exactly can they go to obtain that information?
Right, so PiggyVest can be located at www.PiggyVest.com. And I'll put the details in the chat, and we're on Twitter and Instagram at PiggyBankNG. Our handles are verified across all social media platforms, but essentially, yeah, people can learn more, and I think that it can be adapted in places where like Black people are congregated and concentrated, because we don't have as much resources that can stretch, and so we have to save, so we need platforms like that.
Thank you. Yeah, so Norbert, I'm curious to learn more about AfricaGen's African Digital Index. Please, can you share with us, especially in countries that perhaps are not as progressive as Rwanda, how have you been able to merge entrepreneurship, innovation, and technology in such a way that it could ultimately contribute to stemming all of the crazy things that have come out of COVID-19 and impacted our communities?
Yeah, thank you, Chichi, for the question. Really, again, very happy to be here with all of you. I think I can give the perspective of Rwanda, my country, which has seen maybe a bit different of an approach towards COVID-19, both in terms of the managing the disease, but also economically. And one thing that this disease has taught all of us is it has shown the difference between countries that are well managed and the countries that are not, or that the importance of governance, especially the resulting confidence that the population has in the leadership. So what you have seen, for example, in Rwanda, we had a month and a half complete lockdown where nobody could move around the country. You couldn't move from your street to the next without really having to explain why you have to do that. But the people complied, and the government was able to identify very quickly the vulnerable population and to deliver assistance to them. So this all really was built on top of years and years of hard work in organizing the society and rebuilding the society, especially after the genocide 1994. And in the first days of the response to COVID, you could see clearly that the entrepreneurs, especially the tech entrepreneurs, had a lot to contribute, but also creatives and other innovators had a lot to contribute. So we had, for example, a USSD code that was developed in a response to the overwhelming numbers to the toll-free center for the Rwanda Medical Center that they had set up for people to call in if they need some information or they have any kind of issues or they want to be tested. So this number was quickly overwhelmed, and a group of youth from the K-Lab, which is Kigali's biggest co-working space, came up with the USSD solution in 2 days. And another example is how the government was able to put all the curriculum from primary school all the way to vocational school and universities online in about 2 weeks. So if anybody has suggested that we put all our curriculum online in 2 weeks, nobody would have believed it can happen. But just because of the urgency of the issue and the platform that the government had built to communicate with the entrepreneurs, it was really put up very quickly by just combining
It looks like we're losing Norbert there. So while he's working to reconnect, perhaps, oh, Norbert, can you hear us? Okay, you kind of cut out there. It cut you off. And you're muted now. So if you could just unmute and then pick back up, right? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it just froze for me, though, so I didn't even realize what was going on. So if you can hear me okay, I will continue. So I was saying that actually there's been a lot of good response on COVID by many African countries. And one example I can show you is the collaboration through the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences between Rwanda, Senegal, and other countries to come up with ways to test as little as possible in terms of numbers, but to get the biggest statistical results being able. So it's a very complex mathematics that myself, I don't understand, but I'm happy to share with you the studies that were published. But basically, we brought together the best mathematicians on the continent to come up with ways to test as little people as possible in terms of numbers, but obtain the most correct estimations of what is going on in a certain community. So really, what I want to emphasize on is that we have seen many really good solutions coming out of Africa. If you talk about Rwanda, Senegal, Ghana, Madagascar, that have solved problem with such innovative spirit and also hard work that I personally am convinced that post-COVID, things like CFTA will be much easier to implement because the African people will have much more confidence in the governments, at least I think in a majority of countries. But that doesn't say that in some countries there haven't been some big problem. But maybe to conclude and to respond to your questions, what we have seen in terms of response, both from the government, from the entrepreneurs, in terms of technology, has really come down to the trust that the people have and the working relationship they have between the different aspects of society. And where they have given results is because of that effort.
Thank you, Norbert. And Paulo, I want to loop you back into the conversation. I know that you're currently working with over 90 different companies. And given the sudden rupture in the movements and just the economic plight in the various communities, you were talking about the favelas really being really impacted. Can you share more about how you'll continue to engage with these companies, what the new normal will essentially look like post-lockdown and yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's a really good question because there's when you start the pandemic and all the news talking about lockdown and removing the possibility of people going out to the city, and of course we all received that in a really shocking way, and most of business they were not prepared for that, right? So financially, but also in terms of technology. So I always say that this crisis is actually pushing us in a really hard and sad and deep way to a more digital society kind. When nowadays you have to use much more e-commerce and delivery and tools and apps, etc. But those Afro-Brazilian business, they were not ready for that. So the big companies, they were already using technology like Zoom. They were already using different apps and management tools online, etc. But if you think about like a small shop on the street, or the guy who was selling fruits, they are really not ready for those kind of disruptive moments. So we kind of nowadays at Vale do Dendê, I can speak more about our work here, but I'm sure it's happening in other business incubator like ours across the country, is actually trying to help them with several skills. One is mental health, right? Because if you are in the middle of this crisis, have no financial support, you have a family to take care, it's really overwhelmed. So you have to really think about mental health. The second is understanding financials, understanding how, which bill should I pay, how can I talk to the bank to kind of negotiate some of this debt. So it's a very important knowledge that we are also, teaching them, and also talking about finances, also make sure they understand about credits. There are credits available, but they don't have a relationship with the banks, as I said earlier. So it's a very important thing. The third thing, very important, is really digital skills. So that you're also teaching them how to use digital skills. For example, restaurants, small restaurants, they are used to clients go there, sit, and they take care of the clients. But now you have to use delivery tools and apps, and most of them didn't know that. So nowadays they are trying to learn how to do that. And it's a very important thing. Also, if you have a small shop to sell clothing, for example, you have to have e-commerce now. So we're also talking about that. And the fourth, and I think the most important, is how we respond to the crisis, right? How this business respond to this crisis with innovation. So in our network, we have really innovative people. Some of them are actually in this call here. I can see Arthur from Afro Saúde. Afro Saúde is like Afro Health. It's a health tech who they just created to connect Black doctors, Black people who work on the medical industry, medical segments, to support people who are getting COVID. So they have now a toll-free number. They have a chat bot when people can call and get information. There are other examples I can talk more in a minute, but pretty much we cover these 5 aspects, giving the idea to help them with their mental health, access to credit, financial background, and also innovation and the digital tools.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Very insightful to hear about what's happening on the ground and how you're really linking and connecting the various organizations and small businesses that you work with to resources. And I also want to take time out to thank all of the people who have tuned in, either whether you joined us from the beginning or you're just now joining. I just want to extend a welcome and a thank you for all of you that are contributing, and in a moment we will get a chance to hear more of your questions and respond to some of your questions. So Odunayo, I'm really curious to learn more about, a lot of the work that you've done thus far has really been focused on the inclusion of women and access, especially for women in STEM and tech, access to technologies. Please, if you could share with us how your other initiatives really have created more space for female engagement in the tech space. And also if you could speak to the benefits of global networks, if you've been able to plug into other spaces, whether it's virtually, and yeah, how you plan to just kind of continue to contribute to these activities that are inclusive of women.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So 7 years ago, when I started in tech, in Nigeria, in the Nigerian tech ecosystem, there was like 10 women, and you could go to every conference, every event, and it would be you and like 4 other women, and that was just it, repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. And what that led to was, when you went to meetings to pitch, people assumed you were there to take notes. People assumed you were not investment worthy. People make all of these assumptions. And I thought that makes it impossible for me to look back and convince any other young girl who's coming after me that tech is a worthy path towards their future if we are not going to see them be able to make any worthwhile contribution. And that simply can't stand, because representation matters. Like looking forward and seeing Black women be able to open these doors is or any woman at all. But for me, looking at, I remember where I was when President Obama was sworn in. And I remember looking at the American White House and realizing, maybe, that's Michelle Obama over there. Maybe that can be any of us. And then going back in history and seeing just how many inventions were actually made by Black women that we are not taught. So I did some research, found myself some Black role models, even though they were not alive anymore, and then decided that we're going to make tech more accessible for women. And even when everyone was telling me that it would be more expedient to allow my male co-founders go and do the fundraise, I refused and said, if we're going to raise funds for our company, I will be there. And then we went on to raise $1.1 million, and all of a sudden the door was just suddenly open. And we could, and that was a huge deal, because in the world, right, there's less than 100 Black women who are venture funded to the tune of $1 million and above. And that's unbelievable. There is no reason why we're still having firsts for Black women in 2020. And so I decided that, in addition to running a tech company that focuses on including women, allowing women to put money aside, allowing women to stock up and build their own riches and give them interest and learn how to invest from scratch, we're going to create a different initiative for young professional women to network and be able to just, there's like men's clubs and boys clubs, and no one questions those. So why don't we have that for women? Why does every woman have to go through the hard step to make it that the other woman went through? There's no reason for that. So my mission and what my initiatives do, I work with Wine and Wine Nigeria, which is an initiative that helps young Nigerian women come together, find solutions to their problems, seek jobs, focus on their mental health, and just generally come into their own as young women. I also work with accelerators in Nigeria that are focused on women in tech, Greenhouse, Itana, just kind of to help them shine the light on Black female talent and bring them into tech. For me, it's in the Nigerian tech ecosystem, being a visible woman means that the journey that I went through, the discrimination, the hardships, it took me to raise my first round of funding for PiggyVest. We had to bootstrap for 1.5 years before the first person gave us our first 50K. The next woman doesn't have to go through that. And that's really what I'm working towards. A world where women are able to start fintech companies and go fundraise alone, and no one is asking, where is the supporting man? You know, or where you are able to, as a professional woman, build a business from start to scale and be able to just turn over these revenues. We don't want less than 100 women raising $1 million. We don't want less than 100 Black women raising $1 million. We want $1 million to be seed funding for Black women in Nigeria and across the world. And that's what it's really about. Financially, we've been excluded. You know, when people talk about exclusion, people are thinking of people who don't use banks, but even young women who have smartphones are financially excluded. And we really need to dig into that and figure out how we can bring everyone into the financial ecosystem, regardless of gender, and then bring young women, people who are in primary school, secondary school, into STEM, because we need more women in technology. You're not going to get products that are inclusive if you don't have inclusivity in the back end. It's just the same way we look at TV shows. If there's Black women in the writer's room, there's Black representation on the screen. It's the same way in tech.
Wow. I am truly inspired. Yes, thank you so much. Everything that you've mentioned thus far is huge. As someone who works on gender issues in Uganda, essentially to increase access to funding for small businesses. I know I myself, I haven't done much work in Brazil, but I know that in Brazil, for example, when we look at the breakdown, when we disaggregate the data and we look at the breakdown of the number of entrepreneurs who are engaged, Black entrepreneurs in Brazil, a large proportion, a large percentage of those people are women. So as you mentioned, it's huge. It's huge to be able to have access to resources, especially when you come, you know, you might have a brilliant idea, you might have a vision, but at the end of the day, money is what makes the world go round. And in order to connect these people to resources, they need to have access. And so that being said, I just also want to talk about how my platform, I have two platforms that I'll focus specifically on Sproutly support services. My platform is a platform where, you know, if you are an entrepreneur and you're particularly interested in seeking out funding opportunities, you can go there and you can find ongoing applications, an updated list of just various resources. Because like you mentioned, it shouldn't necessarily take almost, you mentioned 1.5 years, 2 years just to secure the first round of funding. You know, that's very, very restrictive in one's ability to be able to progress and to move forward in what it is that they're trying to do. So thank you so much for sharing that, Odunayo. And I see that we are, we're approaching a time where we're gonna take a break and hear from you all, the crowd. Thank you again for tuning in. So I wanna go back to Norbert and all that you shared with us in regards to the African Digital Index. So the whole point of this discussion, we know that COVID has truly impacted all communities, but severely impacted Black communities in the global Black diaspora. So I'm curious to know, can you share more about, do you have any thoughts on how AfricaGen's African Digital Index can be connected to other multinational, continent-wide indices for contact tracing, greater information sharing about COVID. If you could share a little bit more about that, that would be very insightful.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So first of all, maybe I can explain a little bit what the ADI is. So African Digital Index is an initiative by AfricaGen to basically measure the progress of the digitization in Africa. So the main motivation behind that is that you can't progress when you're not measuring. You can't know if you're really progressing if you're not correctly measuring what is going on around a certain subject. So we have started with Rwanda, Angola, and Ethiopia for now as pilot countries. And we have more than 30 indices across 8 categories to actually measure each layer of the digital economy. And to understand the importance, at least for us, the importance of the digital economy is that it is comparable to what the industrial age was in the 19th and the 20th century, is what we're going through right now in the world with the digital economy. So the digital economy will be at the heart of everything that Africa and Africans in the diaspora is going to go through. It's an enabler because it allows us to connect. What we're having right now, this kind of connection, this kind of exchange would not have happened 20 years ago before we had Zoom and others. But also because it allows us to really aggregate our wisdom and our knowledge to really solve things. So looking at the digital economy, you have to look at all assets of it. So for example, the first category in the ADI is actually energy, because before you even talk about computers, if I don't have lights, then what kind of computing are we talking about? It's been said a lot that computer is a human rights, computing at least is a human rights, but we need more Africans to get access to it. So we're measuring by looking at the connectivity data on electricity connectivity, and we can then give each country a score. This is where Ethiopia is, this is where Rwanda is, this is where Senegal is. Then we move from the electricity connectivity to the actual internet connectivity. And then we can look at not only the percentage who have access to high-speed internet, but also how many people have access to smartphones, etc. So I'm not gonna go through the entire 8 categories, but to answer your question, of course, we are looking for partners in every domain, because if, for example, there is an entity which is specialized or which is very knowledgeable about the use of electricity in Africa, we're more than happy to work with them. If there's a company that is working on, for example, what Odunayo is doing, which is representation or diversity, this is something that we also understand, and we also need. And there are many, many other African initiatives that we're working with that can bring us closer to the goal of understanding exactly where Africa stands in terms of digitization. Now, I have to really emphasize this point, that ADI is only a tool towards what we're looking for. So to have the right aims and goals in mind is very important. That's why we start with things like Agenda 2063 and trying to see these other agreements that African countries have had, for example, from the Broadband Commission, of what kind of connectivity, internet connectivity, can be considered good enough or can be considered useful. And we use that now as a benchmark to, to figure out where this country or that country stands. But and another way we have found, which is, for example, AfricaGen is working with the Africa Tech and Creative Group, which was established last year, which is a consortium of entrepreneurs from all over the continent, including the founders of iHub, of CC Hub, for people from Botswana, who have come together to really trying to mobilize the African people, but also the governments for the tech and creative industries. That is a very strong partner of AfricaGen. And this is the kind of initiatives that we really like to participate in, because when you look at what happened during COVID-19 in most countries is that, yes, the tech and creative industries have thrived. In Rwanda, the P2P transfers of mobile money was up by 300% this month. And it's every month it is going up this much. This to tell you the impact. 300% is massive for this kind of figures. So, but the problem is I cannot pay somebody who is in Nigeria. If I like Davido as an artist and he's having a concert and I want to just support him by, I don't know, sending him $1 or a flower or 10 cents, I cannot do it. So Africans, especially now if you talk about Africans from the continent and Africa from the diaspora, we are not economically linked, and it's not going to be cash linked. That's too late. We're going to be digitally linked through the digital economy. I know that I have many, not only musicians, but artists and other creatives from the Caribbean that I'm really, really big fan of, that I follow, that I would like to contribute to the life in one way or another. I know many bloggers and YouTubers of African descent or Africans who are going around the world, who are doing great things and teaching me that I would like to support. When we see platforms like Patreon for the Western creator, and we don't have the same thing in Africa, then this becomes a problem. So you can now see why an issue like Africans being able to pay each other is crucial, not only to solve what we're going through during COVID, but going forward as well. If today for me to send money to Ghana, I need to pay $50 and it takes 5 days, even if I'm sending $60, there's a problem. But the Chinese from Shanghai can send any money instantly to any Chinese across Hong Kong and many other areas. And of course, we wonder why we're still having problems. So we are communicating, it's good, but we need to be linked economically. And that's where we're heading. So to bring back now that aspect of we need Africans to pay each other to the ADI is that now you need to be able to measure it. So how we're measuring the aspect of payments in ADI is that first we are looking at the amount of money that is being paid electronically within a country to determine if they have the baseline of, they're growing into a digital economy. But the second aspect is now the connectivity. Can I from Rwanda pay somebody from Botswana and they get money instantly? Or does it take 5 days and pass through New York, Frankfurt, and God knows which other city? So the measuring aspect is important. But next to the measuring, there needs to be measures to actually improve the situation or solve the problem that you identified. But without having the measurement, it will be difficult to set targets. So maybe to conclude, another reason why we created the ADI is because having worked in technology for quite a long time, I have always been witness of many different technology agendas being set by outsiders in Africa. So you find that whatever the Rwanda ICT 2030 plan was mostly funded or influenced by some country or another or an international organization. So by bringing this ADI in in a more open sourced way, we can have data that will be really, really accurate, that are contributed to by the people. And ultimately, not only can our governments learn from it and use them, but also the SMEs. So if I'm a payment company in Rwanda and I want to expand to another African country, it costs me so much money to do that research that if I'm not a giant being funded by Silicon Valley, it's not going to be possible. But if you have an accessible index where I can go and look at different areas of Africa, then it will be possible for me to determine I'm going to invest there because I have that intelligence.
Thank you so much, Norbert. Very insightful. And I do have some follow-up questions. But before we get to that, I really want to address some of the questions that have been raised in the chat. And I also want to encourage you all to continue to be interactive and to continue to ask your questions. And we will hopefully answer most of them. And if not, we will share our handles and, you will be able to continue to have access to resources, the various resources available to us. So one person in the crowd, well, a few people in the crowd have been asking questions about how do we address the lack of access to capital. And Odunayo, you already touched on this. You mentioned that you've even mobilized groups, you've done a lot of community organizing, you've held a lot of discussions, you've shared a lot of resources. Paulo, could you share a little bit more about what you're doing in order to can you share some of the strategies and the methods that you've used to help some of these small and medium enterprises obtain access to any capital that they may be seeking out?
Yeah, definitely. Well, before that, just to jump a little bit to the question you guys raised before on the, on the payments and access to banks, and also with the profile of the entrepreneurs, as you said earlier, Chichi, in Brazil, the persona of the entrepreneur is actually a Black woman. That's the leading force for entrepreneurship. But most of them, as the Afro-Brazilian community as a whole, basically they are pushed to entrepreneurship because of the discrimination of the job markets, because of the environment we're not supported to this segment of society. And that's why, we try to help them with the skills and also with connections. In terms of the banking and the access to financial capital support, funny enough, Brazil is nowadays one of the leading force on the digital economy. We're the biggest communities on the platform like Facebook, YouTube. You are the second or the third largest community on these platforms. And maybe the last 10 years, a lot of capital from VC and private equity, they are actually coming to Brazil. But guess what? Who are benefiting from that process? And of course, those European descendants who really have historically access to the European, counterparts and the families and the funds and the representations, and also to the U.S. Most of them go, they study the U.S. and they are fellows from different universities. So it's kind of easier to them because the network to kind of get these resources. So we have in Brazil, I guess, around 10 unicorns, so far, companies and fintechs, companies who are doing great on payments and also delivering services and etc. The gig economy in general. But with that, we have no data. That's the problem. We don't have a specific data. So Norbert, you should talk more about how can you get specific data on the Afro-Brazilian markets, specifically on the digital economy and our participation on this game. As you said earlier, and you guys said in general, that's going to be the most important sector in the society. We're talking now about AI. We're talking about blockchain, talking about augmented reality, virtual reality. All these things are very important. So to specifically answer your question, teach about how we are supporting this small business. So we're pretty much doing two processes. One is a fundraising with support of a multinational company and big companies here. Most of them, they are pretty much trying to work on the relief, of course, donating medical equipment and also basic food for those communities in the favelas. We see it's very, very important and crucial in these moments. And also we say to them, look, we should think about, in the midterm, how even after, the pandemic ends, how the economic, disaster will take place in this country as we are very unequal. So that's why we come together around 6 business incubators, including the incubator that I represent. So we created an alliance called De Todos. I'll write down the name. So this alliance is pretty much trying to raise funds and to give it to this small entrepreneurs. They can pay personal debts, they pay rents, they pay electricity, internet, but also they can pay the debts for the business. That's one part. Another part, it's the crowdfunding. So far we have some crowdfunding. By the way, those are really good initiatives who are using crowdfunding. You have a Traz Favela, which is an app basically to help. It's like a delivery app inside favelas. So they actually focus on these areas because the traditional apps, they don't take care about these areas. So they are fundraising. We are helping them to fundraise. There's another, we are also in the call here, Studio Mova, who is a startup who helps get beauty and help Black women to get to the beauty industry. So it's pretty much helping them with the crowdfunding and also getting support from companies to make sure they can survive these crazy and really sad times.
Thank you. Also helpful, and I'm sure that you share the link to your website or where people can obtain access to information on these incubators and these various resources. And so, Odunayo, please, if you could just share a little bit more about what you consider to be the successful bridges between tech and entrepreneurs in Africa and counterparts in the diaspora in North America. What do we need to accelerate this? For those of us who are stateside, who reside in the West, Europe, etc., how can we really plug in and tap into these spaces where people are requesting resources and access to greater funding opportunities?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is somewhat in the question in the sense that one of the biggest barriers that startups in developing nations, which are Black populated, are facing is the lack of funding, right? It's extremely hard to get funding because when, first of all, investors invest in people who look like them. So obviously we need more Black fund managers, we need more female fund managers. And if people in the diaspora have access to disposable income, that could go a long way in developing countries like Nigeria, for instance. $1 today is like 450 naira in Nigeria. So that kind of thing, it goes a long way for a growing business. And it's not just like funding, it's the network, right? The partnerships, right? It's everything. It's kind of like a 360 outlook. I was able to, as an entrepreneur, I've been privileged to go for the Google Launchpad Accelerator, Black Box in the US. I've attended a couple of international accelerator programs, and the past funding, the biggest opportunities there are the people you meet. And you just never get access to those people if you sat in your own country. And we have to admit that there is some element of privilege to being able to travel out of your own country to meet those opportunities where they are. So what I think some Nigerians have started doing is curating their network and organizing kind of like trips to Nigeria for people to do like an entrepreneurship tour, stop at some accelerator programs, stop at some startup offices, and begin to see how you can bridge the gaps, right? Like remittances are a big deal in Nigeria. In last year, remittances accounted for $26 billion in revenue for the country. There is a link there between fintech companies in Nigeria and people abroad, and we're still trying to find it. So, I mean, I think that the link has to start first from communication. We need to speak more to ourselves. We need to understand what the problems are. And we've already identified some funding and network, right? If you're connected to the US government, the US government has a ton of relief programs that startups in Nigeria, in Brazil, in Rwanda could use. You know, you have networks of investors, and investors don't have to be people who have venture capital firms. We have people that have angel investors who are just investing informally, right? I have $5,000, I can invest in this growing business. It goes a long way. I have $6,000, I have $3,000, or we as a group of people have $10,000, goes a long way. Or I know this person who knows this person who knows this supplier. Like, it's not really, it's a community thing, right? There's this thing that the white community has hacked, right? They're able to keep the wealth in the community. They're like the biggest like hackers of generational wealth. And we need to do that in the Black community. We need to be able to pass wealth down from generation to generation. We need to be able to pass wealth down from network to network, from circle to circle. And it's first by bridging that communication between both communities and understanding that the goal is the same, to see Black people at the helm of more businesses, to see women at the helm of more businesses. So from funding to network to connections, we can start from there.
Thank you so much, Odunayo. And I also want to retract take 2 steps back. You know, when I first asked the question, Odunayo, I asked, oh, well, how can we be more inclusive and how can we connect those who are in the Western world to the African diaspora on the continent. And I want to apologize, especially as someone who is really all about diversity and inclusion and equity. And I want to focus on the South collaboration. So also want to be inclusive of the global Black diaspora existing within the Southern Hemisphere. And so, yeah, I mean, I know that maybe perhaps Paulo or Norbert, if you could perhaps offer insight on how maybe even digitally we can connect and continue to engage people and support entrepreneurs who are working in those spaces.
Yes, definitely. Well, I think this is actually a really, really important question, because we are here, you know, I'm really happy to, you know, see so many Africans connecting, and we are discussing pretty much, you know, the same issues that's, you know, it's across the globe, right? So we're talking about health problems, we're talking about, you know, gender problems, you know, inequality, we're talking about economic disparities, we're talking about things that are global. But before we could really connect, you know, because several things, you know, there's language barrier, there is access to technology, there is all the stuff. But I think nowadays we can have more this conversation, especially among, you know, the Africans in continents and the Africans here on the diaspora. And by the way, that's very important you guys understand. Most of you know, people don't realize how, you know, African we are here. We are just, you know, happen to born in Brazil, but we are Africans. You know, we can trace our ancestry to the motherland, you know, from different countries, of course. And you know, of course, not everybody have the same feeling, but you know, personally, and me and other fellows think that we are, you know, African, you know, Afro-Brazilians. We are African first. We are Pan-Africans. So that's an important thing. And you know, to be honest, sometimes I think, wow, on the 20th last century, a leader like Marcus Garvey was already publishing in these articles in Spanish and translated to Spanish and Portuguese, and they were, you know, connecting thousands of people across the globe. And here we are, you know, 2020, you know, with technology, we have, you know, WhatsApp, we have Zoom, we have everything, and we should do more, right? So we should really be more connected, and we should really think globally, because if you get in a global mindset, you know, we can reduce our problems, because, you know, economically, only in Brazil, the consuming power of the Afro-Brazilian community is 1.7 billion reais. It's really a big amount. And if you combine our economic power in Brazil, in Colombia, in the United States, and in the Caribbean, and the continents, wow, I mean, we really could be a really powerful force. So I think, you know, we should really be connecting. And at the end of this panel, I would love to connect to you guys on social media. Let's continue the conversation. Let's push the agenda, because that's our moment, right?
Okay, thank you so much. Norbert, did you have anything that you would like to ask before we hand over the floor to the audience and give them an opportunity to ask questions?
No, I got disconnected a little bit. I don't know what I missed, but I just wanted to say I shared my contact in the chat. Now that I'm reconnected, it's appeared, but I'm sure it's still there. But I'll be more than happy to connect with everybody. And I'm especially happy that there are so many people from the Afro descendants in the Latin America, especially. I think is the time for us to connect. So I'm very happy about that.
Thank you, absolutely. As Paulo mentioned, a very large percentage of African descendants can be found in Brazil, southern America. So we want to make sure that we're inclusive. And so now we are going to turn the floor over to the audience. And so the way that this will work, we want to give you all a chance to come on and to share ask your questions live. So feel free to raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, we'll select people from the crowd, and I'll just go ahead and call on you to go ahead and come on board and contribute. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to call on Abdul Karim, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Please do correct me.
Yes.
Mute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My English is not very good because I am Francophone, so I will try really to express my question. I thank you to you to organize this very good conference, and it's really interesting. I would like to understand, in Africa, we have our own economy. We have like modern economy, informal economy, and traditional economy. And I see that all the efforts are focused on the modern economy. But how to work with our own economic system, African economic system? We have our own ecosystem, basically on the traditional economic and informal economic. For example, in Chad, our economy is 70% informal. But meaning 70% of traditional entrepreneurs are not measured, are not visible, are not reachable. So how technology can make all those young people who are involved in the traditional economy in our village or little compound, or I don't know, in background of Africa, they are not visible. They are not counted. So I think that we have to reinvent our own economic system if we want that this impact of economy and technology will be real. So how we can do it? And second question is, all you are telling it is possible, but if there are not a politics, our politics are not involved in this. Young people want to have a project, have an incredible idea, but our leaders are not with us or don't understand all these things. So how we can involve our politics to make them understand that what's happening is very important. They have to involve, because the top of decision is the politics, because you cannot do business, you cannot make Africans' connectivity rise if your leaders don't understand that it's important. Most of them are just focused on their power or how they gain election again, but they don't care. So how we can do it? The last question is about diaspora. About diaspora, it's very important. Before to ask the diaspora to go Africa, it is important, maybe it's important for us to link different diasporas exist. We have not linked between us.
Thank you. Thank you. These are great questions. And before we engage our panel speakers, I just want to take one or two more questions. Please, Chimamobi, you had your hand raised. Please feel free to ask your question. We want to hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is very short. Maybe even similar to Abdul Karim's question. So we know that mainstream banks have for a long time excluded poor women in Africa, or those that are working in the informal sector, for example, those that are outside of traditional financial systems or sectors. Money pools, we call them SUSU, or I think in Brazil they call them consortio, or you can call them Rosca, depending on where you are. These money pools have been on the rise lately, and I'm seeing that particularly now in during lockdown situations. maybe they are more relevant. So I'm asking the panel, where do we go as individuals to learn more about how to organize or start such money clubs or money pools or susu? I'm thinking they are relevant to the African community, both on and off the continent. I would love to hear if you have similar views on that, or if you have any such money clubs where you are, and how do you start one those, or is there any online training, or how can I direct young people in my area to go and learn about susonomics, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant question. So I do want to encourage folks to raise your hands. Please don't be shy. This is a space really to just kind of brainstorm, collaborate, share ideas, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. And so, yes, I'll go ahead and allow the panel speakers, Paulo, Odunayo, Norbert, to respond to some of the questions that were posed. The first question focusing on the various types of economies, and given the fact that a large percentage of the economies are people who are engaging in any form of entrepreneurship or business on the ground, can be classified or attributed as part of the informal economy. How can we support them? How can we be inclusive, especially through tech?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll be brief on this, but I think yes, you know, in our country, especially in the so-called developed world and emerging countries, you know, most of the economy is actually made by the so-called informal, people who doesn't necessarily get benefits from the government. They also don't pay taxes. And it's quite outstanding to see that because like Brazil, funny enough, I was seeing the statistics, 46 million people have no bank accounts, and a country like Brazil, the top 10 economy in the world. So it shows how our communities are marginalized. And the problem here is when they don't have access to be formalized or be on an economy, traditional economy, they don't have access to benefits and insurance and also capital, right? Because you cannot have the capital without a bank account, without being formal. Yeah, so now there's a really big space for us to develop apps and initiatives as the technology develops for payments and for kind of fintechs and things like that. So there's a big space for that. I know the continent are actually the leader on that. Countries like Kenya, always being on the head of the game on this, and I'm sure others run as well. So we are trying to bring this to Brazil as well. But my point here is without having support, they will not get to the formal economy. Here in Brazil, you have a new law next maybe 5 years or 6 years when you can have a personal company. So when you pay really little tax, and then you can have access to the formal system. So I'm sure, I don't know if other countries have that, so I can share this law, and maybe you guys can talk to your lawmakers about that, because it's very important to include people in the economy.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing you say is that in as much as there are a lot of businesses that comprise of the informal economy, what we really have to think about is, well, how can we reach those people and help them to formalize their various platforms, whatever it is that they've launched, because without that formalization, it leaves them very vulnerable. Thank you. So we want to make sure, in the interest of time, that we get to answer all of those questions. Odunayo, let's to Chima's question. He asks, where do we go as individuals to learn more about how we can organize money pools, money clubs, etc.? Are there any online trainings that one can take or that you're aware of, or any other resources that haven't already been mentioned?
Right. So money pools, I think, are already a staple of the informal economy. And I feel like, I think that if you just Google how to run an offline cooperative, you get a ton of hits. But there's like modernized versions of money pools that exist. And we have one of such on the PiggyVest platform called the Target Savings, where you can come together with your friends and save towards a particular target. So everybody can be contributing 1,000 naira, or everybody contributing 500 naira towards the target. So they exist, and for the most part, you can use the internet to structure it any way you want in that regard. So try PiggyVest, try other like cooperative platforms, and you'll be able to use them. But I also wanted to answer Abdul Karim's question about the different kinds of economy. I think that for the most part, we tend to look at the informal economy as a group of people who are financially disorganized, and that's not true. There's something that someone I respect says a lot, and that's banking is essential, but banks are not. I'm going to use Nigeria as an example. We have 100 million people in Nigeria who live in extreme poverty, which means that they earn daily, right? Their economy is largely informal, but the kind of financial help that they need is not tech, it's not a fancy app, it's credit, it's sustainable credit that can allow them change tax brackets to then be able to use those platforms that we've built. Secondly, is the fact that people in the informal economy are actually banking. They're just not banking the way we know banking to be, right? They're exchanging money, they're exchanging goods and services, they're doing cooperatives that they record in books. That's a form of banking. And I think that like the view that most of us hold of banks being these big institutions that everyone must walk into has to change. They are carrying out banking procedures, and they're not worried about formal banking because they don't have enough money to put in a formal bank. In Nigeria, if you put money in your bank account, SMS charges, account maintenance charges, your money starts to go lower than what you put into it. That's a problem for people who earn day to day, people who have to put their money back into their business the next day. So people are carrying out banking. Banking is essential, banks are not. And people in the informal economy need credit, sustainable credit. Sustainable cheap credit can only be afforded to them by the government. Private sector is mostly profit oriented and cannot offer like sustainable credit to the people in the informal economy. So if you're asking the diaspora to come in to help the informal sector, at the end of the day, there is going to be a point where they start to take advantage of them. I think about 3 months ago, we heard Google shutting down lending companies and lending apps in China on the Play Store because it was predatory lending. Predatory lending is something you want to avoid as much as possible when you're dealing with people who already don't have enough.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for delineating that. The various types of resources that are available and the infrastructures and kind of which spaces to reach out to. Norbert, please, if you could offer any insight on that very tough question that we received, how can we engage political leaders? Because at the end of the day, if there is a strong lack of political will that could contribute to really limiting possibilities and opportunities to reach out to the most vulnerable people who are working to establish platforms and build themselves up as entrepreneurs.
Yes, thank you, Chichi. That's indeed a very difficult question. Thank you, Abdul Karim, for the question. I think when it comes to the political issue, there's no one size fits all. I think every country on the continent and outside has their own kind of problem to solve, but there are some things that are common to all of them. And that's what I would like, to see more young people focus on. So number one is accountability. So many of our leaders are not accountable, and it's up to the people to make them accountable. If you are not making your leaders accountable, then ultimately you have a role to play in the failure of your system, because that is really your job. It's the job of the people. Now, I'm not one to suggest any kind of movement or campaign, you know, that will cover the entire continent or everywhere where there are Black people are living to do something about politics. But I would really encourage it for people to start at the unit where they are. So if you are an entrepreneur, if you are, you know, part of your family, and that's why maybe I want to link this with what you were talking about in terms of cooperative. I think the African, at least the widespread African model of governance was in a way decentralized. It was more about the family, the village, the community, and how they handle the problems, and that everybody within that, no matter how small circle, has a role to play and accountability that is put on them. So if you are in a cooperative, if you decide to organize a cooperative with your fellow entrepreneurs or your fellow, no matter what kind of association you're involved in, this is a very good way to actually starting to get organized, you know, as the Pan-African mantra, which is that, you know, organize, don't agonize. And that's really something that many, many Africans need to understand, is that you should first start by solving your own problem. Of course, in some countries, in some cases, there are problems that are so big that maybe even a revolution is required. But that's not necessarily the truth for everybody. But one thing that we do have in common is that at a community level, and we all live in a community, whether it's a Black family in Colombia or in Manhattan or in Kigali, we all have communities. Now, how do we make our communities better? And that's, for me, is something that each one of us should look into. And again, there is no single solution because the communities, their lived history, all of that is very different. But what I can share from Rwanda is that accountability has played a massive, massive role in bringing a government that works, making everybody accountable at all levels. Even for Rwandans in the diaspora, they have to be organized, and you have to be organized in a certain way, and you have to be accountable to the community that you lead. Now, to conclude, I want to come back to what was talked about the informal economy and the cooperatives and how to formalize them. And I think the best way is to illustrate with an example. So, you know, there's a saying that when you have a nail, when you have a hammer, every problem becomes a nail. So it might sound like, you know, I'm interested, I'm passionate, I work in technology. That doesn't mean that I see every problem being solved by technology. But indeed, there are some problems where there's no other way to actually solve it than going through technology. So I'll give a very simple example of a group of farmers that I work with in Uganda. So it was a cooperative of about 6,000 farmers who could not get access to credit because whenever they went to the big banks, the banks told them, listen, you don't have any track record of transactions. How do you know what kind of money you are making? Good, I have 200 cows. Okay, can we get any kind of ownership license to show that you actually have these 200 cows? So what they did, these cooperatives, they worked together to actually digitize all the transactions because they all worked for a small number of milk collection companies. And we just digitized that collection of milk and payment associated with it so that they would get their money on mobile money. And every transaction will be digitized. Now, what that had as a result is that previously, the milk collection company would pay them once a month. They would come and say, okay, we came to collect milk 20 times. This is how much milk we collected. This is how much money you are owed. But even that will take a week or so before they could come back, and there was always possibility of error. But by having it digitized, then by the end of the month, it was just a matter of printing out how much money do we owe him, and you go and you pay him. But the biggest vision that came out of that is that we took those transaction the history, and we brought it to the banks. And the banks were completely astonished. They say, okay, actually, these people are more bankable than the majority of middle class in Kampala because of how much money they get, how much is the cash flow, and all of that. So to bring somebody out of the informal sector into the formal sector, either you formalize the processes that they are using, or you organize them into a cooperative which can represent them. There's really no two ways about it. And if we all understand, we're going to work towards that.
Spot on, Norbert. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We had a very engaging crowd. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over the mic back to Nyeleti and Nusha. So I just want to thank you all again.
Thank you very much, everybody. We had a fantastic discussion, and at least I was left extremely fulfilled and inspired and on fire, because our speakers were definitely on fire today. I wish that this conversation could go even longer because it's such an important topic. So thank you all very much. We have not made this possible without the support of our partners. So I just want to make sure that I thank particularly the Portland's Institute that have been a fantastic partner in supporting us throughout this endeavor, but as well as the Internet Without Borders, Open Think Tank Network, the Youth Cafe, the Pan-African Council, the Global Business School Network, Web Roots Democracy, Civil Tech Innovation Network, the African Diaspora Youth Forum in Europe, the University of Pretoria, and the ACP Young Professionals Network. So thank you very much for all, and I'll leave it now to my co-founder, Nyeleti Howana, to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Nusha. And first, thank you to our panel members and our speakers and our moderator. This panel has really been fantastic. It's been the perfect way to close out this webinar series that we've had. I think what has come from these very deep dives into these issues is that COVID is something that is affecting everybody on multiple levels, right? And there's so many more conversations to be had. So with that, we are happy to announce that we will be continuing our conversations around COVID, around technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. We'll be looking to make sure that this is really a global conversation, to be hosting our Francophone and Lusophone series of the same sort. And so for those of you who are joining us from the Lusophone world and from the Francophone world, we encourage you to also bring your networks and your expertise to bear, because, you know, the point about this kind of inclusivity is that, as we say, we have Black people everywhere and they don't all speak English. And so please look out for that. We'll be sending that through our mailing list, through our social media. So if you don't follow us, please do. Please like us and subscribe to our channels. Please also go to globalblackyouth.com and come on board with our mailing list to get up-to-date information. Lastly, I want to just bring out one quote for me from this meeting that really spoke to me. That was Paulo's quote, "I was born in Brazil. I happen to be born in Brazil, but I'm African." That really encapsulates what Global Black Youth is all about. There is this thriving, innovative community of young Black change makers, disruptors, innovators, and all we do is bring them together and foster these kinds of conversations. And so if you want to be a part of that, if you want to support us in that, we encourage you to reach out from us. We've heard from brothers and sisters as far away as China, Turkey, the Pacific, Latin America. This is really a global movement, and we are so heartened and encouraged by the chat and the engagement that you all have shown. So we've gone a little bit over time. I'll thank you all once more and remind you, for those of you who are not pressed for time, we will be leaving this meeting room open for about 15 minutes to allow for further free discussion. You can speak to the speakers, you can speak to myself and Yusha, or to each other. So with that, we officially close, and thank you very much.